campus when we're there. For the moment, it's all virtual, but I don't know how many of you know LSJS, but for those of you who don't, we specialize in excellence in Jewish education, and that includes running adult education programs, as well as training and developing teachers and educators for our schools and for the community. So it is very apt that we are welcoming 4 excellent educators this evening for this session, which is called Stories from the Darkness. They're all wonderful educators: Jude Williams, Rabbi Yoni Birnbaum, Angela Gluck, Rachel Century, who you'll be hearing from. So I am looking forward to their session, and you will have a chance to ask questions through the chat, and I am going to be handing straight over to you. Let me remember to record this session. Yes. Okay. Cassie, you ready to go?
Thank you, Jo, and it's wonderful to be with everybody this afternoon or this evening. I'm Jude and one of the educators, and what I'm going to do is just frame our stories. We're going to tell you 3 stories, and my job is to frame it and give you an approach of what it is as educators for March of the Living to be telling stories from the Holocaust. The March of the Living could be subtitled Light from the Darkness. It's a 6-day trip in Poland where the climax is really, and the seminal moment is definitely in Auschwitz on the March of the Living itself, where we walk between Auschwitz and Birkenau and then have a ceremony. And that moment is really the moment of 12,000 people coming from all over the world. And for many, that is why they come with us on the trip to Poland. But we set it up with 5 days before that. And those 5 days, we cover 1,000 years of Jewish history. And I guess in telling you these stories, I want to outline the approach we take and why it is we take 5 days before we would take that one journey, that one memorial walk between Auschwitz and Birkenau. For us, history is really important. The facts, what we know, to tell history, to make sure that we study it and understand it. But that isn't only our job. Our job is also about deconstructing that history and looking at the different themes and the way that history has changed and moved over the years. And in that way, it's something we'll do this afternoon when we look at resistance and the way that the idea of resistance has changed over time. The third thing we do is we tell individual stories and stories of communities. And we do that again for a very particular reason. So those are our 3 parts. I'm going to start with a bit of history. Let's put us all in the same place. Poland, 1939. If you look at this map, which Cassie is about to put up, you'll see a map of Poland as it was divided as the war started. Remind you, Poland had 3.3 million Jews prior to the war, about 10% of the Polish population. It's hugely urbanized, the Jewish community, and there was a huge amount of poverty as well. And there's certainly a debate about whether the Jewish community in Poland and Jewry in Poland was on the up or actually on the down. Religious life is huge. And most of what we know in Jewish life today, you can trace back to Poland at this time. So religious life is very rich. At the same time, so is cultural life. Yiddish, Polish, and Hebrew culture are extraordinary at the time. 1939, the war begins. Poland is split in 2. And you can see here on the west side, the German area, right in the middle, the general government, which includes Warsaw and Krakow and Lublin, was under Nazi control. And then the eastern side was under the Russian control. My next slide shows what happened in that general government, in that middle area. In 1939 to 1941, the ghettos are established. That is the disenfranchisement and the isolation of the Jews from the rest of society. On the map, you can see a number of ghettos, but actually there are many, many, many more small ghettos being set up. as the Jews are moved out of society and into the ghettos, where there is a lack of food, the work is hard, there are regular shootings, life is really difficult. And one of our stories will come from the Warsaw Ghetto. On my next slide, I'm going to show the next moment in July 1941, where Hitler decides he's going to invade the Soviet Union. And so the troops move towards the east and take on another million, maybe 2 million Jews are under the control of the Nazis. In between July 1941 and January 1942, there is a decision to exterminate the Jews. The first part of that is the Einsatzgruppen. In 4 commands, you can see them sweeping here eastward behind the army, and they go into village by village, round up the Jews, take them to the nearest forest, ask them to dig pits, shoot them. And as begins the extermination of the Jews. As we continue on our next slide, into 1942, you'll see the establishment of the death camps, the Nazi death camps in Poland. Those names that we know, Auschwitz, Belzec, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Chelmno. And the entire extermination process is beginning. At the beginning of 1942, most of the 6 million Jews are still alive. By the end of 1943, 80% of the 6 million are already dead. And within that context, we have our other 2 stories. One from a small rural village south of Lublin called Markowa,
about that.
and one from inside Auschwitz. So, why do we tell these stories? Well, as I maybe said, we tell history, we deconstruct history, and then we tell stories. The stories are so important because in some ways, our 6-day trip to Poland is a little bit like a shiver. At a shiver, we don't sit around and talk about the person and their last moments and the terribleness of the disease or whatever it was that took them. We build a legacy of their life. We tell stories in order to build a memory of that person that will last a lifetime. And so when we go to Poland, our main mission is to create those memories for people. To remember that 1,000 years of history cannot be told through the minutiae of how they were killed, but actually by celebrating and understanding their life. But at the same time, there's some sort of uncovering what happened during this Holocaust. And this we get our historiography, our deconstruction of history, our understanding of history in its amazing detail in order to understand themes. And as I said, we'll explore a little bit here, resistance. For sure, in the 1950s and 60s, resistance in the Holocaust was understood in very black and white terms. If you resisted, you were fighting. You had a gun in your hands and you were resisting the Nazis. But over the years, as we've done more and more historical research, that's changed. And our understanding of what was happening to people is much more detailed. And our understanding of what resistance could mean has also matured and become more sophisticated. I hope as we move now into those stories with a little bit of a historical background, you'll understand and see that by telling stories, we really can bring history to life and bring some lightness from the dark. I'm now going to hand over to Rachel, and she takes us to Auschwitz.
Thank you so much, Jude, for that really helpful introduction. And thank you so much to the LSJS and to March of the Living for hosting this session and inviting me to speak. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Sonderkommando. So the Sonderkommando, or special squads, were work units in the Nazi death camps. They consisted of male, mainly Jewish prisoners who were forced to work in and around the gas chambers and the crematorium of several of the Nazi death camps, which Jude showed us the map of: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Chelmno, Belzec, and Sobibor. They were responsible for a number of different duties, such as disrobing victims, shaving women's hair, leading victims directly into the gas chambers, handling and removing the bodies from the gas chambers, removing any gold teeth and prosthetics from the corpses, and finally, the grinding of bones not incinerated in the crematorium. Members of the Sonderkommando would be regularly replaced, with new members being responsible for taking the bodies of their predecessors to the crematorium once they too had been murdered in the gas chambers. Of the men who joined the Sonderkommando, some actively chose to join because they were enticed by the larger food rations. They hoped it might increase their chance of survival. Others were forced to join under the threat of death. And though they had larger food rations and better living conditions, the Sonderkommando were forced to witness unimaginable horrors. Abraham Bomba was a Polish Jew and a barber. He was sent to Treblinka, where he was forced to cut women's hair before they were sent to the gas chambers. He was interviewed for Claude Lanzmann's documentary Shoah, and he recalled that the Sonderkommando would sometimes have to lead members of their own family into the gas chambers. The trauma of the daily duties had a significant impact on the members of the Sonderkommando, as you can expect. And surviving members subsequently shared their stories, remember feeling emotionless, deadened by the cruelty they were forced to witness. Philipp Müller was assigned to the Auschwitz Sonderkommando when he was just 20 years old, and he recalls witnessing a group of Czech Jews singing both the Hatikva and the Czechoslovakian national anthem as they entered the gas chamber. And he said that after this moment, he felt he had no longer any reason to live. As several members of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando refused to stand by. They took a stand, and they were a light in the darkness. As I mentioned, in an attempt to hide evidence of their crimes, the Nazis would frequently kill members of the Sonderkommando, so they would not be able to testify to the horrors they had witnessed. But some members of the Sonderkommando decided to try and make sure that the world knew what the Nazis were doing. Zalman Löwenthal, Zalman Grodowski, and Leib Langfuss, through great difficulty, obtained pens and paper and wrote down their experiences of working in the Sonderkommando to provide evidence of the Nazi crimes to the outside world. And following liberation, these documents, which have become known as the Scrolls of Auschwitz, were found, buried in the ground at Auschwitz, amongst cremated ashes and burned bodies. Löwenthal wrote in these scrolls, "We, the Sonderkommandos, have wanted for a long time to put an end to our terrible labor. The day is coming. It could happen today or tomorrow." And this is a reference to the uprising at Auschwitz, another example of members of the Sonderkommando refusing to stand by. And this is what I would like to talk a little bit more about today. On the 7th of October, 1944, the Sonderkommando assigned to Crematorium 4 learned that their time was up and that the Nazis planned to kill them. And in an act of rebellion, these members set fire to one of the crematoria at Auschwitz. And this act of resistance sparked a series of revolts at Auschwitz. The Sonderkommando working at Crematorium 2 attacked several SS guards, and several hundred prisoners escaped from Birkenau. All were caught and executed by the SS. This uprising at Auschwitz would not have been possible without the bravery of young Jewish women, including Róza Robota, who I hope Cassie is going to show us a picture of. Thank you, Cassie. You can see Róza here. Róza was working in the clothing detail in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She received a small amount of gunpowder, which had been smuggled in by women, including Esther Wachblum, Ella Gartner, and Regina Safierstein, who were all working in a munitions factory close by to the Auschwitz complex. The gunpowder was passed from Róza onto members of the Sonderkommando who led the uprising. The SS identified the women that they thought were responsible and involved in the uprising, and they executed them all. We don't actually know very much about Róza, but by sharing with you today what we do know, we are honouring Róza's memory, restoring her identity to her. The sources that I found don't always agree on all the details, but there is enough information to build up a picture of Róza for us to find out a little bit more about her. Róza was born in Ciepłnikov in Poland, which you can see here in this map where the red dot is, just north of Warsaw. And we think she was born in either 1921 or 1923. She was a member of the town's Hashomer Hatzair movement, a Zionist socialist pioneering youth movement, whose aim was to educate Jewish youth for kibbutz life in Israel. And here are two more photos of Róza. You can see her circled in one photo. In the other photo, she's in the back row with the gentleman. After the Nazis arrived in Ciepłnikov, Róza and her sister were forced to work as cleaners in the house of the Polish government's former leader. They were both tortured and abused while they were working. The house was destroyed shortly afterwards, and they returned to their family and moved into the Ciepłnikov ghetto together with their family, where they remained for around 3 years. In 1942, the ghetto was destroyed, all the families taken to Auschwitz. Róza would have been around 19 or 20 at the time. She survived the selection process. The rest of her family did not, and they would have been sent straight to the gas chambers. The women's camp at Birkenau had opened in August 1942, and Róza was one of the first inmates to be placed there. When the Jewish underground began their plans for a revolt in the middle of 1943, they contacted Róza to ask if she could help organize the smuggling of explosives out of the factory. As I mentioned, Róza was working in the clothing detail, but she contacted some women who worked in the factory producing gunpowder, including Esther Wachblum, Ella Gartner, and Regina Saffierstein. And these 3 women managed to get explosives and gunpowder out of the factory, smuggled in cloths, which they then hid in their body, despite the huge risk if they were caught. It's been estimated that about 20 other women also helped with this, and all of them were between the ages of 18 and 22. Not all of these women were caught, some of them did survive, and it's through their testimony that we're able to know more about this story. So when Róza was given the explosives, she then transferred them to the Sonderkommando with the help of 3 male prisoners, Noah Zabludowicz, Israel Gutman, and Yehuda Laufer. The explosives were hidden among corpses and securely placed in crematorium number 4. This clandestine operation lasted for 1.5 years, and then October the 7th, 1944, the Sonderkommando revolt began. The prisoners killed 3 guards and succeeded in extensively damaging the crematorium. Around 250 prisoners died fighting, and a further 200 were murdered in the aftermath. After the uprising, as I said, the SS identified the women they thought were involved. These women were beaten, raped, tortured, in an attempt to get them to reveal the names of those involved in the revolt. What I think is remarkable is they did not reveal any names apart from those who were already dead. Noah Zabludowicz, a fellow underground member who was from the same city as Róza and who she had smuggled the explosives to, managed to persuade the capo in charge of the torture bunker to let him in one night. He gave testimony after the Holocaust, and he recalls what happened when he entered her cell. On the cold cement lay a figure like a heap of rags. At the sound of the door opening, she turned her face to me. Then she spoke her last words. She told me that she had not betrayed anyone. She wished to tell her comrades that they had nothing to fear. We must carry on. It was easier for her to die, knowing that our actions would continue. It was a pity to lose one's life and have to leave this world, but she did not regret her actions. She was not sorry that it was her lot to die. I received from her a note for the comrades outside. It was signed with the exhortation, Chazak v'amatz, be strong and of good courage. The time came to leave, and I left the bunker. This was the last time I saw Róza face to face, but I will never forget her. Just a few days later, on January the 5th or 6th, 1945, after months of torture, the Gestapo collected all the women who had worked alongside Roberta in the clothing factory and those who had worked alongside Wachstum, Saphirstein and Gertner in the explosives factory. And all of these women were made to stand and watch as they hung the 4 women. They did it in 2 sections, first Gertner and Roberta in the evening, and Wachstum and Saphirstein the following morning. The women cried out in their last moments, calling for vengeance and singing the Polish national anthem. According to one report, Róza Robota shouted, "Be strong and be brave," as the trapdoor dropped. Just a few weeks later, on the 27th of January, Auschwitz was liberated. The remaining prisoners were freed. These 4 women were the last to be executed there. Back in Chernihiv, where Róza was born, there were no more Jews left in the town which itself had been founded by Jewish immigrants more than 100 years earlier. Thank you. Back to Jude.
Thank you, Rachel, for that moving story and such an important story to be heard. We're going to now move back in time to the ghetto in Warsaw, the biggest ghetto set up in Poland. And to tell us more of the story of Rabbi Shapira is Rabbi Yoni.
Thank you very much, Jude. Thank you also to Rachel for a fascinating and really important presentation. What I'd like to share with you in the time that we have today is about a particular individual, a leader in the Warsaw Ghetto, whose name was Rabbi Clonimus Kalman Shapira. And I'd like to share with you why he's an important figure and what he has to teach us about the history of the Holocaust in general, about life inside the ghetto, and particularly the Warsaw Ghetto. So to begin, let me just give you a little brief overview of the Warsaw Ghetto itself, because that's important to the story as well. So in November 1940, so the Nazis obviously invaded in September 1939, comes November 1940, they established a ghetto in Warsaw. As Jude mentioned, this was the largest ghetto established in Poland. But the fact that it was the largest ghetto in Poland did not mean it was large itself. The most important and I think striking statistic about the Warsaw Ghetto is the fact that 30%, near enough 30% of the population of Warsaw is crowded into an area that is the size of about 2.4% of the city. And that means you're talking about 8 to 10 people per room on average. It's about 146,000 people per square kilometer. The overcrowding is intense. Every aspect of life is almost unbearable, yet people have to bear it. And between the October 1940 and the summer of 1942, people manage in the ghetto to establish some form of life, some form of cultural life, and some form of every aspect of life has to function. So even though all around them people are dying of starvation, cold, disease, some estimates say around about 92,000, which is about 20% of the ghetto's population, die of either starvation, cold, or disease. Nevertheless, life has to go on, and life does go on. And as far as possible, the inhabitants of the ghetto try and keep their lives going, if you like, in the best possible way that they can manage. In July 1942 is the Great Deportation. In a very short space of time, some 254,000 are sent to Treblinka to be exterminated in Treblinka. And then you'll be familiar with April 1943 is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that leads to eventually the demolition of the ghetto during the following few months. So what we're really focusing on is that period between October 1940 and July 1942. That time when people in the ghetto are trying to maintain their humanity, maintain their dignity, and maintain their lives as far as possible in some way as a reflection of how they lived before the war. Rabbi Shapira is important because he was a Hasidic Rebbe, he was a religious leader before the war. He was already established as a very important figure. He had a large following, a very large crowd of followers, and was very highly respected. And during the war, he was thrust into that position. He was already a religious leader. And what we have for Rabbi Shapira uniquely is a record of the sermons, the weekly sermons dated that he delivered to his community between those years, 1940 to 1942. In fact, the final sermon in the collection was delivered on the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av, July 1942. So it was just before that great deportation. So it's almost unique as a resource and as a way of understanding the feelings that were going through the population at the time. How does a leader try and inspire his flock at that particular time? You know, you can already see that there are so many lessons that we can learn. There are so many things we can learn about what life was like far beyond his own actual religious community. We'll be able, hopefully, to see a little bit about and actually maybe learn together in just a couple of minutes something of what actually Rabbi Shapira actually said and wrote. But it's important to understand who the person was as well. Rabbi Shapira was he was already, as I said, as I mentioned before, well known before the war. He wrote a very important book called Chovat HaTalmidim, which is the obligation of the students. And in this way, some have pointed out he had some similarity in his educational approach to Janusz Korczak, who was a very, very, very famous figure in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto. He inspired many people really and generations, if you like, about his approach and his forward-thinking approach towards the education of children. Rabbi Shapiro too believed in the vision of every child having their own potential for greatness. So he believed in teaching through joy. He was in that sense very Hasidically orientated. The Hasidim have that in a sense of the notion of joy permeating through life itself. In September 1939, he suffers his own personal horrific tragedy. This is a year before the ghetto is established, because when the bombs land on Warsaw, his son, daughter-in-law, and sister-in-law are all killed by those bombs. So he's already in an incredibly difficult personal situation. Yet he shows remarkable leadership during the war itself. The reason why we have access to these sermons is because when the Great Deportation, as I say, they end just before that time in summer 1942, when the Great Deportation occurs, and Rabbi Shapira it becomes aware, he is saved by the Judenrat, and he is taken to the Jewish police force within the ghetto. He is sent to work in a Schultz factory, one of the factories that exists in the ghetto, but that marks the end of his. As if we don't have any literary work for him after that time. But what did he do during those 3 years? So let's try and understand. Let's firstly, I think Cassie's got a picture of the rabbi, so we can see a picture of him. I think should have one of the slides there. So that's a picture of Rabbi Shapiro. Well, I think it's important to understand that Rabbi Shapiro, in his sermons, these weekly sermons, rarely mentions any particular event. He doesn't even really refer to the deaths of his own children. He really talks about themes and ideas to try and support and strengthen, and particularly psychological strategies based, of course, on his religious beliefs, on religious teachings, that he wishes to try and help people through this time. Scholars who have studied his work point out that suffering, the topic of suffering, is a primary theme in 43 out of the 87 sermons collected in the book, which shows that he was directly addressing the notion of suffering itself. How were people able to contextualize and understand and put some meaning into what they were facing? This is what he had to do, which was an immensely difficult task, living through this as they were. Also important to bear in mind that although in the ghetto itself, we know there were many, many different communities, religious, non-religious, all types of communities, it's clear that he was well known and well respected. We know that, for example, because a man called Shimon Huberbrand, who was one of the major diarists as part of the Warsaw Ghetto Archive, he records in his diary that at one particular gathering in June 1940, there was some 150 people. Now, if you think about that in terms of number of people in the ghetto gathering in one place to hear a sermon, that's a lot of people, 150 people. So he clearly had this following. what are the main themes of Rabbi Shapira's work? So with this, I think it would be useful to actually read something that he wrote, which is taken from Hanukkah. I think Cassie can show us another slide. Okay, so the next, yeah, okay, you can pause on that slide first just to show what that this is one of the famous milk churns that the Warsaw Ghetto Archive, the buried in Emanuel Ringelblum, led this. Many of you may know this. The collection of a huge, important historical collection of artifacts to be able to document life and what went on in the ghetto. Rabbi Shapiro was able to get those his writings through this Rabbi Huber band to Emanuel Ringelblum, and that's how they survived. When he realized that the ghetto was eventually going to be destroyed, he was able to give them to him. So we'll go on to the next slide just to take a look at some of what he actually wrote. So the next slide is taken from the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and that is an actual copy. They have the actual copy of the sermons, the original handwritten notes that he made. He delivered these sermons on a Shabbat afternoon towards the end of Shabbat, but of course he would have written them in advance. We also know there were lots of annotations in the margins so that he went back over them, added thoughts, which is also important for scholars studying his work. And I should point out that recently, a few years ago, a critical edition of his work had, appeared, which basically goes through in great detail, shows where he annotated it afterwards, and we learn a lot from. And this particular page, I think, was from Hanukkah, possibly 1941. We'll see on the next slide, Cassie, if that's possible. Thank you. Yes, December 1941. So this is a translation of a section of that page you've just seen. And just look at what he says. He says, in all honesty, he says, this is speaking to these people in 1941 in the ghetto. What room is there for doubts, God forbid, and for questions? It is true that torments such as those that we currently endure occur only every several hundred years. However, how can we attempt to understand God's actions or having our faith damaged, God forbid, once we fail to understand them? If one blade of grass created by God is beyond our understanding, how are we to understand the soul? Or even less so, how are we to understand an angel or the mind of God himself? How can we expect to understand with our mind what God knows and understands? Why is it that one has his faith damaged by questioning God? Because of the suffering that Jews endure these days, and not because of the suffering Jews had endured from time immemorial. And he carries on in a similar vein. He talks about what about all the suffering we've experienced through the ages? Those who say, he says, those few lines later, those who say that Jews never had to endure such torments and suffering are mistaken. They were the fate of the Jews throughout history, the destruction of the temple at Beitar, etc. And then he says, obviously, he prays for the end to the suffering. And he says, the reason why today's suffering damages a person's faith more than the suffering endured by Jews in the past, is that one's own self and suffering matter most. If someone says that one flinches, he flinches only in the sight of his fellows being tortured. While he may be genuinely worried and affected by the torture of other Jews, he says deep inside, the profound impression left on him is a fear of finding himself in the same horrible situation. It is this feeling that, God forbid, damages one's faith and causes that person to doubt God. Therefore, we have already said that one must be willing to sacrifice one's soul, oneself, relinquish all one's ties. Only then can one's faith be perfect, and one can wholeheartedly believe that everything's just and a result of God's love of the Jewish people, of the people of Israel. So you see, this is to our ears. We hear this and we think, this is really difficult for us to even begin to understand what he's trying to convey. But if you put yourself in the minds, particularly of his listeners, what is he trying to do here? What he's trying to do is somehow provide something, some context, if you like, for how they're experiencing things. And he's saying to his listeners, put your faith in God, because that's all you have. He's trying to effectively elevate in some way that suffering to this, what we might say, a cosmic significance. He talks about in his sermons elsewhere the idea that God suffers himself with the suffering of the Jewish people. He doesn't refer once, it's very interesting this, to the Nazis by name, not once. In his entire sermons, he never mentions them by name. And I'm sure that was a strategy. That was a deliberate, and he knew, that's all they heard about. They heard about them all the time. But he didn't want to mention that. He wanted to use those moments with his flock, if you like, to somehow elevate them and bring them up to a level where they could somehow cope with life itself and the incredibly difficult things they were experiencing. Rabbi Shapira himself And I will just read to you a quote from a particular historian who whose name is Abramson, who studied in great detail this Henry Abramson, who studied the works of Rabbi Shapira. He says like this. He says, by removing the discussion from the mundane political concerns of the day and placing it in a cosmic context, Rabbi Shapira affirms the intense reality of the suffering while simultaneously elevating its importance. The suffering chassid is not an insignificant pawn in a large human war, oppressed by the mighty and powerful. He is a holy warrior fighting with his suffering for all that is sacred in the universe. That, he says, is really the thrust of what Rabbi Shapira is trying to convey through his sermons. Just to complete with how Rabbi Shapira's own life, just to finish with how his own life ended, he is deported in himself to Trojaniki in 1943 after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising is crushed. So he's in the ghetto all the way through the uprising, and after that he's taken to Trojaniki, which is near Lublin. He is supposed to have been given the opportunity to escape from the concentration camp, but apparently he refused. And during the uprising in Treblinka, we know what happened. There was an uprising in Treblinka and Sobibor, and as a result, the Nazis launched what was known as the Operation Harvest Festival in November 3rd, 1943. And as part of that operation, Trojaniki itself was completely razed to the ground. All the inhabitants were massacred, including Rabbi Shapira himself. That is the story of Rabbi Shapira's life, a story which, although immensely tragic, I believe gives a measure of inspiration for how so many lived their lives and found something they could cling on to and faith they could hold on to in those dark moments. Someone asked in the chat, what the background is. It's a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto itself, the wall going down the middle. The ghetto is the ghetto is where the buildings are outside the ghetto. They've been bombed and destroyed, but the buildings are outside the ghetto. The other side of the wall is the inside of the ghetto. Thank you all very much for listening, and I'll hand back now to Jude.
Thank you, Rabbi Yoni. When we talk about the Holocaust, we are often quite lost and have so many questions. And you've demonstrated very much how, when we get into the life of somebody and how somebody was living and responding at that time, it can really help us understand more. So thank you for that. For our last story, we'll move to Angela and to a small town just south of Lublin called Markowa. And just pop yourself off mute, Angela.
Thank you. Compassion, courage, critiquing, and creativity. This is about the Ulma family. So what does it mean to be righteous? It sounds biblical, doesn't it? Someone who does the right thing, a person of integrity. But in the context of the Shoah, it has a specific definition. A person who was not Jewish, but who risked their life to save a Jew without any personal gain. And one of the tasks of Yad Vashem, established as early as 1953, was to commemorate the Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the righteous among the nations, and it does. I think a lot about the experiences and characters of the righteous during the Shoah, and often wonder whether I and people I know would have done the same if the situation were reversed, or the same now for someone who is being persecuted. It seems to me that there are possibly 4 qualities that the righteous shared, all beginning with C: compassion, courage, critiquing, and creativity. Compassion may be obvious, sympathy for another human being whose suffering is palpable, a feeling that's strong enough to reach out and offer refuge or some other kind of support. Courage is essential because there are clear dangers, including for family members, friends, and collaborators. Specifically, the enormous risk of being discovered or betrayed and then tortured or even killed. And there is, too, the strength involved in guarding social contacts, in keeping a secret, ensuring that children keep the secret. Critiquing involves some independent thought, perhaps questioning centuries of prejudice, and for sure mentally challenging the prevailing ideology that came with the occupying powers. An ability to think outside the box was central to the role of the righteous. And creativity also involves lateral thinking, devising ways to be supportive, and in some cases having to generate alternatives maybe more than once. So I'm going to focus now on just one particular group of righteous, the Polish couple, Victoria and Józef Ulma, and their children. They're not heard of much outside Poland, but are now very well known within it. And we see them in the first of our slides. So Victoria and Józef were devout Catholics, devoted to each other, married in 1935, and their wedding photo is behind me, when she was 23 and he was 35. They lived here on the outskirts of a village called Markowa, which had a population of about 1,000, close to the town of Łańcut in the southeast of Poland. Like many other local people, they had a small holding, and this is a typical style of housing with a deep roof, though it might not be clear in this historic photo. It's clearer here in my photo of a modern house of a similar style. Now, the loft is significant because it can take a raised floor, allowing for a cavity of, say, 0.5 meter. And because of the height of the loft, that change might not be apparent if there was a raid, but it was deep enough to hide people lying down, silent and still. Józef was a prominent member of the Markowa community, committed to the Catholic Youth Association. Here he's combining his love of books, he was the local librarian, with his love of fruit growing, which he excelled apparently. He kept bees and bred silkworms and was also a keen photographer. Meanwhile, Victoria busied herself with homemaking and the early education of their 8 children. Here there are 4 of them in a nearby field on a summer's day. There's Stasia and Basia, Wojlia and Franek. It seems an idyllic life, but things changed dramatically when the Nazis began deporting Jews in the Łańcut area. We can see here some Shali family members working on the Ulma farm. And the Ulmas, like other residents of Markowa, had witnessed the execution of Jews. Probably 20 families numbering about 120 people in Markowa in the summer of 42. We don't know the exact number of Jewish victims there, though. Jews were snatched from their homes, shot, and buried in a former animal burial ground. Some managed to escape and went into hiding in the surrounding area. And Józef was one of those who helped create hideouts and dugouts in the nearby woodland. But they weren't deep forests, and it could only be a temporary solution. And in fact, in November 42, the local fire brigade was ordered to search for the escapees in the town and the surrounding vicinity, and to turn them over to the Nazis. But not all of them were. Some Markowa residents defied that order with, yes, compassion and courage and critiquing and creativity. Saul Goldman had been a local cattle trader, a Jew, before the war, but he and his sons had to go into hiding. Zvorozhimir Lesh, a Polish policeman who lived near Łańcut, had helped them initially in return for payment, and they also left him their property. But he suddenly stopped helping them and would not return their belongings. So by the autumn of 42, they had no one and nothing and nowhere to go. And in absolute fear for their lives, they knocked on the door of Józef and Victoria Ulma, who took them in. They were soon joined by the 2 daughters and a granddaughter of Chaim Goldman of Markowa itself. There was Leah Didner and her daughter, and Zhenya Grunfeld. The men helped in the tanning of hides. They sawed timber and chopped wood for fuel, as you can see here. The women helped Victoria with keeping the house and caring for the children. But still, the welcome that Victoria and Józef gave to the Jews doubled the size of the household and doubled the demands on the family budget. And I think we can only guess at the stresses and strains of that dynamic and the anxiety of being discovered. In this next picture, I think, judging by the ages of the children, it seems to have been taken, I'm just computing in the summer of 1943. On the left with the black cap is Vajia. To our right of him is Stasha holding Maricia. In the middle is Franek, who is apparently sitting on a dog's back and being supported by his mother Victoria. And then on the right is Basha, who is steadying Antek. But this next photo is probably the last, and it's certainly the only one that has survived of the whole family together. Going clockwise, we have Josef in the top center, Bajia with his black beret, Franek, Antek at the bottom, being fed by Stasha. In the center, there's Basha. On the left, Victoria, pregnant, holding Maricia. Victoria's stage of pregnancy is the clue that this was at least one of the last family photos, because what happened next defies description. On the early morning of the 24th of March 1944, a patrol of German police from Weinsuit under Lieutenant Eilat Deakin came to the house. They'd been informed about the Jews in hiding by Roger Gless, the one who had betrayed the Charlie boys and their father before. The German police surrounded the house and caught all of the 8 Jews. An eyewitness called Edward Navorsky and others who were ordered to look at the executions reported later that the German police shot the Jews in the back of the head. Then the German police killed Josef and the pregnant Victoria, saying, so that the villagers would see what punishment awaited them for hiding Jews. The 6 children screamed at the sight of their parents being killed. After consulting with his superior, a Czech ethnic German, just 23 years old, who was from Sudetenland and serving with the German police, shot 3 children. And 3 other Nazis, known from their frequent presence in Markova region, shot the other children. They shot them one by one in order of age. Stasha, aged 8. Basha, age 7. Vajia, age 6. Franek, age 4. Antek, age 3. And little Maricia, the last, age 2. One of the perpetrators, Josef Kokot, apparently said, "Look at how those Polish pigs are dying, those who were hiding Jews." Within several minutes, the Ulma family and their Jewish guests, who had made some kind of life together for 18 months, all lay dead on the ground, and the German police then ransacked the Ulma family's property. The mayor of Markova, Teofil Kilar, was ordered to bury the victims with the help from other witnesses. And he asked the German commander, whom he'd known from prior inspections and acquisitions of food, why the children were also killed. And Deacon answered him in German, so that you would not have any problems with them. On the 11th of January, the following year, 1945, in defiance of the Nazi prohibition, the closest family of Josef and Victoria exhumed the bodies from their makeshift graves so as to give them a proper Christian burial in the Catholic cemetery of Markova. And that was when they received another shock. From the decomposing body of pregnant Victoria and the position of her unborn child, it was clear that she was in labor at the time of her execution. The story of the Ulma family and the Charlie and Goldman families lay dormant throughout the Soviet period, and it only came to light in 1994 when Poles felt free to speak about the experience and raced against time to record memories. The following year, Yad Vashem recognized Josef and Victoria Ulma as Chassidei Umot Olam, righteous among the nations. And here in Markova itself, in 2004, on the 60th anniversary of their death, this monument to Joseph and Victoria Ulma and their children was unveiled. You'll see that there are 9 symbolic urns. You can count them quite clearly above the stone. For the parents, the 6 children, and the unborn baby. They have posthumously been awarded the Commander's Cross of the Order of Polonia Restituta. On the 24th of March, the date of their execution, is officially marked now as the Polish National Day of Remembrance of Poles rescuing Jews under Nazi occupation. And applications have been made to the Vatican for Victoria and Joseph to be beatified by the Roman Catholic Church, which is a first step to sainthood. More concretely, literally, is the Ulma Family Museum in Markowa. It was set up in 2016, and you may see that the shape of the building echoes the shape of their home. Outside is a wall of names of those Poles who helped Jews, and on the ground in front of it, the names of those who died helping Jews. A question that can be asked, and is often asked, is, were such attitudes, such values, and such behaviors typical or exceptional? I want to end by reflecting on the inscription that appeared on the Markowa Memorial we saw a moment ago. And I'm taking 4 points from the inscription: the poignancy of their sacrifice, the recognition of Judaism as an elder faith, the value of universal love and respect, and the Ulma family as a national treasure. And this is what it reads: saving the lives of others, they laid down their own lives. Hiding 8 elder brothers in faith, they were killed with them. May their sacrifice be a call for respect and love for every human being. They were the sons and daughters of this land, and they will remain in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. The story of Victoria and Joseph Ulma deepens our understanding and our thought processes around our relationship as Jews to Poland and to the Polish people. It's an important story to tell. Courage. Where does courage come from? The courage to fight, the courage to lead, the courage to save somebody else's life. The stories we've told today, as I said, are very much in the spirit of March of the Living and very much in the spirit of Judaism. Judaism doesn't really deal in history. We deal in memory. At Pesach, we tell the story of our Exodus, and we ask each Jew to feel as if it happened to them. When I left Egypt. When we go to Poland, when any of us explore the Holocaust, we are also asking ourselves, this happened to me. For some people, that feels very real and very close. For others, they need to make the journey there in order to really explore it. And our job as educators on the Holocaust has always been about laying the foundation of history, building on it the historiography, the perspectives on history, the critical view of history and understanding of history. But so much more importantly is to add the layer of stories. And then for each of us to take those stories and make them our own memories. Today we've shared 3 stories, which I hope will mean that you can take from the darkness some small light. I just want to end by a private message that came through the chat from Yvonne, who will know very well what it means to take a story like Róza Robota's and make it your own. Because Yvonne wrote, Róza, or Rózalmeth, was my late mother's first cousin. when she was in Auschwitz with Rabbi Jeremy Lawrence when they read that testimony outside the munitions factory. So thank you, Yvonne, for sharing that, because it gives me a certain closeness again to the story, just knowing that there isn't a relative who survives and who can remind us and tell that story themselves too. Thank you, everybody. I'll pass back to Cassie.
Wow, thank you. And thank you to our wonderful educator team for telling us those incredible stories. These stories showcase how we delve into the immense topic of the Holocaust on our journey to Poland. Through the individual stories, exploring the choices people had to make, enable us to learn about our past and challenge ourselves in the present. If you would like any more information on March of the Living, please visit our website. It's in the chat. If you have any children or grandchildren that you think might benefit from the programme, or you yourselves, I invite you all to join us on our next programme in Poland. I just want to remind you that the last session of the day, a very special session, will take place at 8 o'clock. We're having a break for dinner now. The session is Deborah Lipstadt in conversation with Rabbi Dr. Rafi Zaram, talking about what can we all do to ensure the Holocaust and its lessons for humanity are never forgotten. So thank you all for joining. We will be closing this Zoom, and then we will be restarting it at 8 o'clock. So please just click the link to join us at 8 o'clock. Thank you very much, and we'll see you shortly.